Hello and welcome to Solving Climate Change Once and for All. I'm Bihuye, and thank you so much for joining this special edition of our online series, #AllInOnClimate. We're talking to experts and entrepreneurs to learn what from their work we can apply to climate action, and more importantly, to climate justice. You'll leave with the one key thing you can do to make a positive impact. I'm delighted to be joined today by Bill Weihl. He is one of the early champions of climate action for corporations and Time Magazine's 2009 Hero of the Environment. Bill served as the green energy czar at Google, spearheading some well-known initiatives to become carbon neutral, for example, the Climate Savers Computing Initiative and RE Less Than C, or renewable energy cheaper than coal, before moving on to Facebook as Director of Sustainability. He now guides numerous companies on their energy strategies from a board seat, and he's recently launched an incredible nonprofit called Climate Voice, which we'll learn more about today. Feel free to use #AllInOnClimate to tweet and share your favorite takeaways as we go through this interview. Hello and welcome, Bill.
Thanks, B. It's really a pleasure to be here talking to you.
It's great to have you. So, Bill, you've led groundbreaking work with corporations to help them decarbonize their operations for decades at this point. Can you tell us about the day you started your journey with energy work at Google? I'm sure there were a lot of critics that you had to work diligently to win over.
Sure. Google, the reason I joined Google was because they were actually quite passionate about doing something about climate change. I've been working in computer science, first on the faculty at MIT, then in industry here in the Bay Area. I was increasingly concerned about climate change, so I decided to try to focus my professional life on climate action. And I was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. Google hired me in early 2006 to figure out what they should do to address climate. So they really wanted to do something on climate. And that there were absolutely people in the company who had different ideas about what that should be and how it might interact with or potentially interfere with other things the company was doing. But overall, I'd say there was pretty strong support. But we didn't really, I would say neither Google didn't know exactly what they wanted, nor did I. I knew I wanted to do something. Mm-hmm. And they gave me an incredible opportunity. And honestly, that's a little bit of what I'm doing now. Maybe not, I think I know more about what I want and what I'm doing than I did then. The team that we put together for Climate Voice, I think, has a really clear idea of where we want to go and what some of the levers for change are that we can push on. Mm-hmm. But to some extent, we're figuring out how to do it as we go along. And the world is changing around us. And that is forcing us to adjust and pivot and change tactics. The pandemic we're in the middle of has changed a lot of things, for example. So I've been trained as a scientist and engineer. I knew a fair amount about clean energy technology, but not much about other things that are really important for climate. And I was lucky to be put in a position where I could learn from and work with amazing people. And then I moved to Facebook in 2012 in a similar role. And we really built on the work that my team had done at Google and drove massive progress in buying clean energy in our own operations, but also collaboratively with other companies, opening up market access for clean energy in a dozen states or more. We were one of the key companies that helped create the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, which really helped us and others drive impact well beyond our own companies.
I love this message that the energy czar, someone who's so steeped in this industry, is still sort of evolving and figuring out how you can make an impact, because a lot of our listeners, I think, have keen interest and desire to do so, but you don't have to be a climate scientist to make a positive impact. So that's wonderful to hear. I'm curious, was there a tipping point for you to take the leap of faith from tech companies with lots of resources and sort of the motivation to do something around energy and sustainability to now this nonprofit world focused on mobilizing employees and youth?
I'm not sure there was one, but it's been an evolution. When I changed careers in 2005, I was looking to do something on climate, not just stew about it at 3 a.m. when I couldn't sleep and woke up and was worried, right? Which happened. And I think lots of people are in that state today, where they're worried about climate, they read about it, they're not climate scientists, they're not mechanical engineers, they're not energy people, but they want to do something. I think lots of us share that feeling. I still feel that. What partly happened with me, I joined Google. They wanted to do something. I got the opportunity to help them figure it out and to explore and get involved in lots of different areas, from R&D and innovation to financing to energy purchasing, even policy and politics a bit. And that was true at Google and at Facebook. At the beginning, especially at Google, we were focused primarily on technology innovation and on simply buying clean energy and using our power in the marketplace. But over time, I came to appreciate much more how important all of these levers for change are, and especially that climate policy is one of the most important. And let me just try to explain that a little bit. It's really, and this is what we're trying to do with Climate Voice, it's not enough for each of us or each company to kind of pick one thing to do on climate, to use our superpower, if you will. I'm an innovator, I'm going to go invent some new solar technology or battery technology, or I'm an entrepreneur, I'm going to start a company, or whatever. I'm a finance guy, I'm going to go do deals, right? I mean, those are all important. You have a superpower, you should use it as an individual and as a company. All those other things are happening. They'll get us to zero emissions eventually. The problem is that speed really, really matters. We do need to get to zero negative emissions beyond that, but cutting emissions in half by 2030 is really daunting. And if we focus primarily on the 2050 goal, it's easy to end up not doing the things we need to do to hit the 2030 goal, and then we will have blown our carbon budget. And to move at that speed, we need public policy. What Climate Voice is about getting companies to go all in on climate, to use whatever they consider their superpower, but also to use their other powers, including being a strong ally and advocate in the fight for climate policy, or in every jurisdiction, every city, state, nation where they operate. And I think the aha moment for me, and maybe it was really the tipping point, which is when I decided to leave Facebook and then ultimately started Climate Voice. It really came when I understood how much influence companies could have on public policy generally, including on climate policy, and how little they were actually choosing to have in most cases. So I decided to leave Facebook and explore how we could convince companies to be much stronger, proactive allies in the fight against climate change. And that led to my recruiting a team over the last 6 months or so, into our launching Climate Voice earlier this year.
That's a great journey to understand that got you to this point, Bill. And I think that what's interesting about it is, I like to think you have to know a paradigm to break a paradigm. And so you know how these large corporations, these tech companies work, what motivates them to participate or not in public policy. So I'm curious, what have you learned in terms of helping break through the structure that might be holding companies back from taking more action?
I think that is in some ways the critical question. It really is about systems thinking, and we all like to think of ourselves as systems thinkers. I think we all are in some ways, but there are also limits to sort of the boundaries of the system we think about. And I think if you believe that public policy is an important element, not the only element, but an important element of addressing climate change, then you really need to understand where the sources of political power are and political influence. And with companies, I think, as I said, we have lots of companies that are acting on climate. They've been leading, they've been doing amazing stuff. There are dozens of collaborative initiatives like RE100 and REBA and science-based targets and so on. Lots of progress, but not enough progress, because emissions are still rising when they need to be falling rapidly. And the problem is that most companies pick a few things to do on climate and ignore many other things. And almost all of them ignore engaging in public policy. The reason, I think, is that they see risk in engaging in public policy. There's the potential for political backlash, blowback of some sort, whether it's they might upset a customer who would stop buying from them, and so it hurts the revenue directly. They might upset some political leader who might then take it out on them and retaliate in some way that affects their core business. So companies for whom climate policy affects their core business, that means energy companies, certainly. They are going to be in there lobbying, advocating for policies that help their business. And that means in the case of the traditional sort of big fossil fuel companies, they've spent decades pushing back against policy that would drive real climate action, because it would mean burning less fossil fuels. And so they are all in on fighting useful climate policy pretty much everywhere. And other companies, if they're not in the energy business, if that any particular climate policy won't directly affect their operations, tend to stay out of it. Mm-hmm. And that means the dominant, sometimes the only business voice in climate policy debates comes from the fossil fuel industry, oil and gas companies, their trade associations, and groups like the Chamber of Commerce that, at least on climate and energy policies, are dominated by the fossil fuel companies. If we want other companies, pro-climate companies that have been leading on climate, to really step up and go all in across their entire business, including and especially in advocating for climate policies, mm-hmm. we need to make it matter directly to them today. Not just as there's this big systemic risk that's going to affect everyone. They think at some point in the future, it's already affecting us. I mean, I live here in California. The fires in California the last few years have been crazy. Mm-hmm. Lots of people have lost their lives, huge amounts of property damage, etc. Australia, large parts of it burned this past winter. So this is not a distant, remote threat. It is here today, and it is getting worse. But most companies look at that and then think about, well, how can I protect myself from that? Not what can I do to help society protect itself? Mm. And to make that happen, they need to understand that if they stay on the sidelines, we all need to understand when companies stay on the sidelines in these debates, they're being complicit with those who want to preserve the status quo.
Right.
And we need to raise the bar, our expectation for those companies from where it's been, which has been real leadership, which is decarbonize your own operations. We need to raise the bar to, you need to be an active participant in decarbonizing society rapidly and putting in place the policies we need for that. That's what we're trying to do with Climate Voice, by having employees and students be the pro-climate voices in companies and outside companies for students, pushing companies to really go all in and make clear that if companies want to hire the best people, want to retain the best people, they really need to step up. So we're trying to empower and mobilize large numbers of employees and students. They take our pledge to urge companies to go all in on climate. And then we give them the tools to actually hold companies accountable, not just as sort of a broad, you need to be all in, but okay, here's a policy in this state or in this region or in this country. And if you were all in on climate, if you were really pro-climate, you would support that policy. So why aren't you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is such an important message, to go all in on climate, not just in your marketing campaigns and the way that you might try to recruit young talent and future employees, but really from this public policy standpoint to create the structure for that change we need immediately. And that's where I think a lot of companies have made missteps and been accused of greenwashing or rainbow washing with LGBT policies, right? That it's not authentic, it's not deep, it's not significant in terms of what the companies are actually doing. So I love that message of going all in and of empowering youth, future employees, to do that safely and to do it really specifically. Like, for each company, this is what we expect, and this is what you have in your power to do. So that's incredible. I think speaking of LGBT, you've drawn really clear parallels to that movement and also climate activism. And they're both sort of seemingly invisible problems, systemic in nature, and often easy to deprioritize for these institutions that hold power. And like you said, don't see it in their sphere of influence to get involved. What have you seen be effective in the LGBT rights movement that you're applying now to the climate fight?
We've been really inspired by the progression of corporate engagement on LGBT rights. And I think with most companies, it wasn't rainbow washing. It hasn't been greenwashing. It's been authentic. The issue I think is that as we make progress on an issue, we need companies to do more to keep making progress, especially when there's an organized opposition that is pushing back really hard. So if you want to be an ally, it's not enough to say, well, we're going to do our part. We will decarbonize our own operations, or we will ban discrimination against LGBT employees and customers in our operations. That was a big step 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. But today, given the struggle and where the struggle is and where the opposition is, if we want to make progress, we need allies to step up even more. And that's what happened in the fight on LGBT rights. If you go back 10 years or a little more, there were dozens, probably hundreds of companies that were acting in their own operations internally. They had their own internal policies. They offered equal benefits to employees in domestic partnerships. They had policies to ban discrimination in hiring, to ban discrimination in who they serve, other policies to basically promote equality in their operations as a company and to eliminate discrimination. And about 10 years ago, that really started to shift. And companies started to step up as real advocates for public policy in favor of equality across society and against discrimination. And the reason why at Facebook, at Google, at dozens of other companies where I've talked to people who were involved in these discussions, the major reason why was that employees spoke up. Mm. And the companies also knew that if they stayed silent, they would be called out on college campuses and in other places for being complicit in denying basic rights to people. And they've been real allies in the fight for equality, as I said. So it's not that they had been rainbow washing. Some of them maybe, but most of them I think were truly authentic and were real allies. But the world had changed. And to make the progress that we needed to make and that those in the movement wanted to make, we needed those companies to move from that internal action to being real public advocates for public policy. And so organizations in the movement told companies it's time to step up. In North Carolina with the bathroom bill, for example, or in Indiana with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, step up or we will call you out for being complicit. Because if you stay silent, that enables those who are trying to enact discriminatory legislation to win. Mm-hmm. And companies recognize that young people might appreciate all they'd already done, but that now the movement, the moment that the movement was in, needed them to get off the sidelines and do more, and that's what people were beginning to expect. And as they stayed on the sidelines, they would be putting themselves at risk. So they got off the sidelines. Climate Voice is creating the same dynamic with climate. So we've got hundreds of companies now that have been leading. They've been acting in their own operations, but very few have been advocates for public policy. There are a few who've been pretty consistent advocates. There are a few more who occasionally speak up, but most pro-climate companies are silent almost all the time. I mean, there are ones like Salesforce, Akamai, Unilever, Patagonia, Adobe, Autodesk, IKEA, Schneider Electric. Those are all companies that have been much more vocal than most others. Right. We need many, many more companies to step up and do the same. With Climate Voice, we are making clear to them the world has changed, that the leadership of the last decade was really vital, and we appreciate what they did, but we're now in a new decade. We've got 2030 staring us in the face where we need to cut emissions in half by then to avoid blowing our carbon budget. And we need public policy to do that. And we need it at the city level, the state level, the federal level in the US, national level in other countries. And it needs to be binding policy, because otherwise, you know, the history of voluntary policy on climate is, given the powerful forces trying to preserve the status quo, it doesn't drive change fast.
Right. And I think we all know that what got you here won't get you there. And that's what we're sort of trying to create, this movement around, even if it's internal, it's not enough until you make it external in the public realm, be an advocate. And I think for me, what isn't getting us there yet is the central topic of this series, which is climate justice. I've seen it overlooked in a lot of my work that I've done, really with energy companies in the sustainability industry. And it's perplexing because it is really about how do we think about people and the impacts on people. So I'd love to hear sort of your definition of climate justice and why you think it's so often overlooked.
I mean, I should start by saying, I think you're right, climate justice is a vital element. And I should say, I am not an expert on it. I mean, there are many things that I am still learning about climate, about environmental justice and climate justice. So let me just preface by saying I am trying to be as humble as I can and learn from others and let those who are most affected by this issue in frontline communities take the lead.
Right.
I think that the environmental movement spent too much of the last 30, 40 years. I don't know if they really focus on climate as an environmental problem and a problem of we need to save the planet, but certainly got portrayed that way.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a human problem. It's an ethical, moral problem, not just an environmental one. It's a question of fairness. And it's a question of what problems we impose on future generations. It's a question of, do we just kick the can down the road and let, people 3 generations from now try to clean up the mess? It's a question of equity. The problems caused by climate change are being felt first and worst by low-income communities and people of color in the US and around the world, often the people who had the least to do with causing the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a fairness issue, it's an equity issue. And they are on the front lines of climate change: extreme heat, wildfires, massive storms, sea level rise around the world. Frontline communities are often poor, they're often people of color. So people talk about saving the planet. I mean, the planet honestly will be fine, it will be different. And loss of biodiversity and species, it will be very sad. But it's changed before, it's going to change no matter what we do, and it will be fine. People will suffer, as will many animals and other living things. And those on the front lines who've often contributed the least to causing the problem will suffer the most. Climate justice, I think, requires us to design solutions that ensure that those frontline communities benefit from the solutions first, or certainly early, not last. And there are lots of reasons why we aren't acting fast enough on climate. There are lots of reasons why I think climate justice is not often front and center. I think that people point to human psychology, that climate is a problem that seems to be distant in time and distant in space. It's happening to people halfway around the world, and it won't happen for decades, which is not true. But the other side works really hard to paint it that way, which makes it harder for people to really engage. And the other side likes to paint it as you'll have to sacrifice to solve it, which is also mostly not true. But we need to act now to avoid catastrophe later. And those kinds of problems are hard to really grapple with as individuals and as a society. And individually, I think no one person wants to feel responsible. And when people talk about climate justice, then people feel like, well, if I'm not the one who needs the justice, then you're blaming me for not being fair and just. And so that causes sometimes, I think, some people to back away. Mm-hmm. And so I think there are lots of reasons where even good-hearted, well-meaning people, which is probably most people, tend to steer away from thinking about that. Mm-hmm. But without the concerted campaigns by the fossil fuel industry over the last several decades, who've been working to prevent action and to create division and confusion, I think we'd be in a very different place today. And I think we need to recognize that that is a major part of the problem and mobilize power and influence to counter what they are doing to drive policy change. It actually is aligned with the science and that is rooted as much as possible in climate justice to solve this problem at the speed we need to solve it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you've touched on a really key point there as well, in that we are coming from this mindset of scarcity, and that is historical in a certain sense in the sustainability industry, where it was all about doing more with less. And I think that has really held us back because we are thinking about, oh, there aren't enough resources, there aren't enough ways that we can still preserve our profit if we take on this sustainability initiative or this renewable energy project. And so we're handicapping ourselves, and that applies totally to the climate justice space as well, in terms of what you said, right? It's not taking from one person to save another person. It has to be about how do we restructure the rules and the policies that are what everybody is working within. So my question for you is, how do we shift from that kind of constraining paradigm where we started, do more with less, to something that's a bit more regenerative or inclusive, or thinking more about abundance?
I think that shift in mindset is vital. I think there's a related shift in mindset, which is from a very narrow focus on individual action and competition, to one of that plus collective action and cooperation. Mm-hmm. So, you talked about, well, we can't engage in this renewable energy project or this energy efficiency project because it might hurt our profits. The truth is, today, that may have been true 10 years ago. Today, most things a company can do to take action in its operations on climate will save it money or make money. Not all, but most.
Totally.
But as long as some of them actually cost it money, if it feels that it is in competition with other companies and they're not acting, then it's going to be afraid to act itself because it is reducing its margins, its profit, and its competitors are not. Mm-hmm. And this is where we need to take collective action. One example of where we need to take collective action and put policies in place that ensure that everyone takes that action. And so, yes, maybe everyone, instead of having their profits grow by 15% a year, they grow by 12, but they're all growing, right? So rather than saying we're each going to maximize our profit and so on, that we focus on how do we make a decent profit and ensure a good outcome for everybody. Mm-hmm. And the problem with this very narrow individualistic focus on competition is that we're each trying to maximize our own outcome, and in the process not doing some of the things we need collectively to create a good outcome for all of us. So I think it is about, we need to focus on the world we want to create, as you said, sort of a view of the world as one of abundance, where the air is clean, the climate is livable, people have good jobs and can thrive, and then decide how we can get there and how we want to get there. But that will require collective action, not just individual action. And collective action in this kind of situation, especially with a very powerful opponent trying to prevent it, requires public policy.
Absolutely. And I think as we're filming this amidst the COVID-19 global pandemic, hopefully some of the perspective of what is enough and what is the world that we want to live in post-pandemic can help create that mindset of, what's a decent profit when you take into account all of the negative externalities and impacts that are created when one person is trying to achieve everything at the expense of everyone else. So definitely good to think about. I'm sure over the years, the decades of work in your career, you've seen a lot in the boardroom, outside the boardroom. And so I like to ask, what's the most shocking thing you've learned in the course of your work?
I have spent most of my career in business. I started in academia. I believe that business can be an incredible force for good, for innovation, for progress, for prosperity and wealth creation. I have been shocked in the last few years at how so many businesses talk about being part of a community, working to improve the conditions, situation for the communities they live and work in, but they constantly push for lower taxes, less regulations, other things that improve their bottom line, but diminish the common good. The recent statement by the Business Roundtable, I think it was August of 2019 when they released this, saying that they have now shifted their view of the purpose of business, that for the previous 25 years, they had said the purpose of business is to create value for shareholders. Sorry, almost got it wrong. So for the owners, they now say the purpose of business is stakeholder value for a broader range of stakeholders. Yes, the shareholders, but also employees, the community we live and work in, our customers, and so on. That is a welcome step forward to where we need to be. I don't think it's enough because it is still very, if you go read that, it is very focused on what businesses can do themselves. And there's no real discussion of the role of government and society setting the rules and how business plays a role in actually determining the rules of the system in which business plays a part. And I think that is a really important part. The current pandemic is a great example. We've had, I think, 3 massive stimulus bailout packages in the US, and there have been other things in other countries. Already, it's now mid-April. There will be more bailout packages and stimulus and recovery packages over the coming months. I mean, already it's been trillions of dollars. By and large, the role of business in Washington, D.C., and my guess is similar in other countries, but I'm certainly seeing what's been going on in Washington, D.C., has been to advocate for what they want or they need from those bailout packages, not to step back and say, and what does society need? And what do we think would be a fair allocation? So they are assuming that the way to get a fair allocation is for everyone to go in and argue for themselves. The problem is that means, of course, the most powerful are the ones who, for historical reasons, may have the most power, get the most. So the fossil fuel companies and others are in there with a lot of power and influence and getting a lot that maybe they don't need, or maybe isn't what we want in terms of, do we want to, as we as a society spend trillions of dollars, do we want to rebuild our economy the way it was, or do we want to spend that money to build it back better to help solve some of the problems that we know are coming down the pike at us? And I think that's something where businesses, they have a role to play, and they can simply get in there and argue for, no, I want my 100 million, my 2 billion, my whatever. Or they could say, we think society needs to do the following things because we all face these additional systemic threats, and this is what we think is needed. As long as they stay out of those debates, it's going to be much harder for us to do what we need to do.
Yeah, that's such a timely example. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that at the local level with mayors and governors trying to think about how do we reopen the West Coast? How do we reopen this geography from a standpoint of all of our stakeholders, not just, the shareholders or the constituents that are keeping me in power. And I think that shift from shareholder to stakeholder that you mentioned, that's something for people in the sustainability industry, in climate action. It's been a long time coming. I remember learning about the triple bottom line back in college over a decade ago. And so it's great for mainstream audiences and for companies to kind of join the movement. But to your point, it's not enough, and there's a lot more yes and, right? Back to your earlier kind of exercise of what it is that we need to do. So this work is hard. It can feel like we're inching along, some gains, some setbacks. I'm sure you've had some low points on this journey. What's been your lowest moment, and how did you come back from that? And overall, kind of where do you derive hope to keep going?
Yeah, I started working seriously on climate 15 years ago, and my admiration and love goes out to the people who've been doing it for 30 or 40 years. It's hard. We've made a lot of progress, not steady, not linear, but progress since then. Not enough. I'd say the lowest moment came in 2017 when President Trump announced that he was going to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement. That was a huge setback. It continues to be a setback. It is, driving, his administration is continuing to roll back lots of regulations and rules in a way that is sending us in the wrong direction on climate. At the same time, lots of states are actually moving forward in major ways. Virginia, for example, just passed, and the governor just signed earlier this week what's called the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which mandates 100% zero carbon electricity on the grid in Virginia by 2045.
Wow.
It's a huge step, right? And it's not the only thing Virginia needs to do on climate. It's a big step. So there are things like that happening in a number of states. We at Climate Voice, that was actually one of the 3 policies we launched with, one of our sort of flagship campaigns that are launched 2 months ago, to push companies to step up and support that bill. And I think given the timing, I don't think we had much impact on whether companies supported that. But I think we had a little, because they knew we had told them that we were about to launch, and that if they wanted to avoid being seen as laggards and as complicit on college campuses, they should think about supporting it. And I think some moved as a result. We've got lots more campaigns like that planned. So I think that gives me hope that we are seeing progress in states, in cities. The biggest source of hope for me is the thousands of people, including the ones who've been doing it for far, far longer than I, but thousands of people who are working really tirelessly to drive progress, and the millions of young people who've been marching in the streets and working really hard, and the leaders in the US and other countries and in states who are enacting the kinds of policies like the ones in Virginia. We need to see more of that, but that progress gives me hope. And the key, I think, is to understand where the levers of influence are that can move that faster. That's what we're trying to do at Climate Voice, is empower people to push on a lever of influence that to date has been mostly neglected. It's not the only thing by any means, but I think it's an important lever to get companies that are pro-climate to actually use their influence, and to in other ways go all in. To every decision they make, one of the questions they should be asking is, what's the impact of this on climate?
So we promised our listeners the one key thing that they can do to make a positive impact. You've made such a strong case for how we all have the power to do so. So how would you break it down, particularly knowing that, youth who might feel disempowered or afraid, or like they might face ramifications from future employers and their career prospects if they are seen as too loud, too active? What's one thing that we can all do?
Yeah, I don't like to name just one. So, I mean, it's a fine question. And 15 years ago, I asked that. Actually, I did a few, right? We put solar in our house, and we bought a Prius, and then I took a job at Google focused on climate. So, but I think one of the things I've learned, as I said earlier, is there isn't one thing. If each of us picks one thing, we're actually all going to be in trouble. So, and I don't want that to put people off. I actually think it's very empowering in a way, that it really is about being all in, and it's about thinking systemically, and then thinking about what are the places where you can make the most impact by focusing your efforts, but also what are the parts of the system where you can add in your influence, add in your effort, even if it's small, in a way that will make a difference. And what are the neglected parts of the system where, unless we all band together, the other side has enough power that it just keeps winning. And I think that's where public policy comes in. If you're an innovator, go innovate. If you're an entrepreneur, go start a company. If you're a finance person, go do deals. Please do what you're really good at. And get involved in politics at the local level, at the state level, at the national level. And push your company, or if you're a student, your potential employers, to get involved in climate policy. And one of the things, you mentioned the fear of retaliation. It's real. A couple of Amazon employees were just fired for being vocal, and I think they were fired because they'd been really active internally. They'd also been very vocal externally and essentially criticizing the company. And so that's why they were fired. There is risk. For students, they might not get the job they want. For employees, they might get fired. We are trying to make activism safe, and that may sound a little like, how can you do that? So employers care about what their employees think and what the students that they need to hire think. even if they don't know which ones feel that way. So if employers knew not that, say, you were being very vocal about an issue, but that 20% of employees would be really unhappy if they, say, stayed silent on climate, stayed on the sidelines, that might give them pause. And if employers knew that 20% of undergraduates and graduate students in the key fields they need to hire in really cared about their employer being all in on climate, that might get them to think, maybe we should step up a lot more than we have been, even if they don't know who those people are. So with Climate Voice, you can sign our pledge. That's a way of saying, I want my employer to be all in. You can ask us to keep your name anonymous. And that means we know who you are. We have your email. We can contact you. We ask you for some demographic information. If you're employed, what company do you work for? If you're in school, what school do you go to? What's your field of study or work? So that we can then tell employers, we've got 5,000, software engineers, in school at these schools, or we've got, Apple say, we've got 800 of your software engineers and 200 of your lawyers and 100 finance people who all say they really care about this. We're not going to tell you who they are, but they're there. And then we will use our voice, our megaphone as an organization to ensure that all of those people know which companies are going all in, which ones are really beginning to step up, which ones are staying on the sideline. And I think the smart companies will look at that and say, our reputation matters, and it especially matters for recruiting and retention. Even in this pandemic where maybe very few companies are hiring, they know they're going to need to hire in a year or 2 or 3. And they don't want to poison the well on college campuses and make it hard for them to hire in a few years when they need to. And if they stay on the sidelines now, we're going to make sure people know about it. We're watching, students are watching, their employees are watching. So I think that's the way in which people can act. I think you need to look at what you're doing in your life and change all the things you can change directly, but also look at where you have influence. And one of the big levers you have influence over is where you work, where you choose to work, or in pushing your employer to behave differently. I like to, if you're a finance person, I've given talks on this to MBA students. And one of the statistics that I hadn't done the math until, a year or so ago that really hit me was, you're going to spend 80 to 90,000 hours of your life at work or more. That's a lot of hours. You should think of that as an investment. And much like the divest invest movement, where we're pushing colleges to divest and others to divest their endowments, their investments from fossil fuels and invest in climate solutions. Mm-hmm. Your career is an investment. And you should invest it in a way that as much as you can is all in on climate.
I think what initially struck me when we were getting to know each other, Bill, was making activism safe. And climate activism, that's at the crux of climate justice. We know that not everyone can hit the streets and protest and feel like they're safe. People of color, women, other parts of the population that might not be able to just take a day off from work to go civically engage. And so to be able to create this platform for people to do it safely, that's what really resonated with me when we first chatted, and having personal experiences of, am I putting my career on the line, even working in energy, to have a stance and to be vocal about what I think we need to be doing more of. So that's incredible. And I think that back to your point about it's yes and, right? And what is our sphere of influence? And it's not just any one thing, it's this litany of things that we can all do. I'm curious what extends to the expectation we have on institutions and governments. You mentioned universities, but sort of as this mobilization happens with individuals, what do we then expect our institutions to do alongside us?
The start is go all in on climate. Companies, nonprofits, universities, you name it, and I'm not sure any company is really quite all in yet. I've named a few that are a lot closer than others: Patagonia, Unilever, IKEA, Akamai, Salesforce, Adobe. Schneider Electric. We need many more. So that, I think, is the start. But that, this current moment with the pandemic is, I think, a critical moment. We are spending trillions of dollars to keep our economy afloat, and we'll be spending trillions more to rebuild and recover over the next couple of years. And as I said, the question is, will we maintain and rebuild the economy as it's been, powered largely by fossil fuels, with frontline communities most at risk? Or will we choose it to spend that money in a way that helps build the world we want and that we need to have to address climate? And some say, we shouldn't be worrying about climate. That's a distraction. That's not fair. We need to focus on survival and recovery. And there's a bit of truth to that, but only a bit. Because when you spend trillions of dollars, you have choices, and you're making a lot of choices. And we need to make those choices wisely. And we're not going to spend trillions more in 5 years, almost certainly, because unless the climate crisis gets so bad and the catastrophes are so bad that people feel compelled to. Mm-hmm. So given that we are spending this money, we need to think hard about how we're spending it and spend it in the wisest way we can. And that means protecting people's jobs and making sure people don't end up homeless, and making sure people aren't hungry, and helping companies survive, and focusing on building the infrastructure and the economy that we need to have for the future. So I think it's, go all in, but don't just think about your own narrow self-interest. Think about what society needs. We need companies to do that. And if they really take what the Business Roundtable said to heart, I think they will do that. We'll see. I hope so. And we're going to do our best to try to encourage them, push them to do that.
Thank you so much, Bill. I mean, I think you've given us a lot to think about, but with one really clear action, which is to go to climatevoice.org, sign up, really embrace that platform as a way to be active safely, and to think about what we can each do in our sphere of influence. And there's a lot. So that's super empowering. I'm very excited to see how we can leverage the tools that Climate Voice is bringing to people who are eager to participate, eager to do more, eager to join the fight, and really grateful for your generous time and insights that you've shared with us all today.
My pleasure. It's been a delight talking with you.